All right, so we're going to start off with a bit of intros. I personally have not heard of any of your guys' companies before moderating today's panel, but that's because you guys are quite specialized and still growing. And just in context, I'm from Vietnam. These three are not yet in Vietnam, so we're going to hear from them. So my first question, I'll start with Pauline and go down the panel here, is if ChatGPT, if I were to use this tool and I searched Pauline, what would it say? What would it say about Pauline?
It's probably going to tell you tune in to Beyond today, and
Okay.
Pauline's going to be presenting on healthcare.
Yes, okay, great.
Probably, yeah.
Good one. Anything else?
Well, I mean, I think that since we're in the healthcare panel, right, just to let you know, a lot of the clinicians, they've started to use ChatGPT themselves, and a lot of medical students as well. So, we've always thought that the healthcare sector was like, epitome of respectable quality work, and it's almost like an insult if they were to use a machine to generate some of this data for them. But hey, guess what? I think the world is changing, and I think they've started as well, and they've realized, at least in some of the stuff that we fund, we are actually funding some of these work using AI to help clinicians make decisions faster, to accelerate the process and to help them with accuracy of data.
Very good. Thank you, Pauline. Elias, same question to you. If I were to search on ChatGPT, what would it say about Elias and your company, Aura?
That's a good question. I wasn't prepared for that one. So I think it will tell you, it will probably be a big response. I'm born and raised in Sweden, Iranian background, lived in Australia for 10 years, 6 years in Southeast Asia, running a healthcare camp. So I think you'll probably get a long response, but I hope it summarizes more than Aura's output of work than it does me personally. So, yeah.
Okay, very good. And we'll have to hear a little bit more about Aura
Yeah, of
in
course.
the panel.
So Aura is a house of consumer healthcare brands that's powered by a kind of a fully verticalized telehealth platform. So we run 3 brands in Malaysia, Singapore, and Philippines. Our first brand is called Modules, which is a prescription-based skincare brand. And we have a men's healthcare brand as well, and a women's reproductive healthcare brand too. So essentially, house of brands. Our vision is to become the uni-level of healthcare brands in Southeast Asia and beyond. And then starting in those 3 markets, launching in Hong Kong soon, and then expanding into the Middle East as well.
Very good. And Kashish, over to you. Last question, same question. What would it say about you and the company that you're with today?
It will probably tell you that Kashish is, probably spends too much time tinkering with his 3D printers, making too many obscure novelty figurines, the ones that are fused with Dwayne Johnson's face, Pikachu's body, that kind of obscure crap. But professionally, though, I work as the CTO of Enlitho. So it would also tell you that what Enlitho and Kashish as an extension are passionate about is, really optimizing micro and nanofabrication to facilitate better healthcare, better advanced sensors within the realm of optics and photonics. We've been doing it for roughly the past 6 years, and we're going to keep trying to, push the boundaries as much as we can.
Okay, so we have a quite diverse panel here. We have one ecosystem builder from Singapore. You're from Singapore too, right?
Yeah, we're Singapore headquarters as well.
Well, actually, everyone's Singapore-based. Okay. We have a consumer healthcare company and a bit more B2B healthcare company, all represented on the panel today. So going back to what the venture investors were saying, 2 of them, I think it was Amy and Ram, were saying that healthcare they're the most bullish on. But there's a very big gap between the first and second players across these industries. So my first 2 questions are for you guys. Why do you think, and of course you're a bit biased, but I want to hear it from you guys. Why is healthcare so top of mind in Southeast Asia for venture investors? What's the opportunity there exactly? So I'm going to start with Kashish here.
I think from what we've experienced so far, Southeast Asia has an abundance of talent. A lot of really talented engineers, great minds over here. We've got an incredible research scene. The innovation here continues to astound me on a day-to-day basis. We've worked with so many research entities, and the things that they're doing are amazing. So I think this is probably part of the magnetic pull that Southeast Asia has. A lot of that, that genius, that talent is being focused into healthcare, building up the scene all the way from AI being used to address healthcare challenges, down to superior diagnostic devices, down to microfabrications, which is what we're doing. So it's just such a bright scene.
All right, and for you, Elias, they mentioned consumer healthcare in particular was of their key focus areas for further investment. Hopefully, Aura can attract some attention from them today, but maybe you can add in
I think
your 2 cents.
they probably came to the same realization that we did when we started this, which was essentially if you go out in the market now and you look for a lot of friction and underserved consumer groups, you easily end up in healthcare because it's a consumer group in kind of the young patient population of the region, and you have less convenience, you have less continuity in healthcare overall. So I think you see a very large young patient population that is living in the capital cities, that are going through a kind of increasing middle class and purchasing power, and are living with a lot of the lifestyle conditions that are being expressed. So I think there's a big opportunity there. And then you also have, of course, the business models that are from US that are proving to be really successful, that are really coming into the region as well.
Can I add on to that?
Yeah, please, Pauline, please add
Even
to
though
that.
you said you wanted to
Yes.
ask the guys only.
That's all right, that's all right. Please do.
Well, I guess from the role that I play in ecosystem building, I do hang around with a lot of investors. And I guess that's what they tell me, right? Southeast Asia is a really, really good growth area. Why? Because a lot of infrastructure has not been set up in Southeast Asia, unlike like Europe and US, where things have already been built, systems have already been set. So it's actually very difficult to introduce new things because they then have to rework everything. And most of the time, people are very reluctant to do so. Here in Southeast Asia, because you're starting from, in a way, you start from a zero base. And because we're so technology enabled, many Southeast Asian countries can just leapfrog, right? They don't have to rework or rebuild. They just build, and then they just accelerate the whole process. So that makes it very attractive, particularly for venture capital, because they can see the growth in a short time. And also because, to Elias' point, besides a young population in Southeast Asia, the young population will eventually age. So healthcare will always be something close to everyone's heart. Like when you're young, you're talking about preventative care. But perhaps when you're old, you're talking about palliative care. So there's always an opportunity in healthcare. Yeah.
Let's talk about that opportunity, because on the first panel to kick off this whole Southeast Asian kind of focus group here today was that I think it was David, one of the CrossFund. He's the founder and director of CrossFund. He was mentioning that a place like Vietnam, 60% of the population is under the age of 30. So my first question is for Elias here. Your startup specifically targets Gen Z and millennials, but that's kind of like a misnomer because young people don't have health problems. So what can a healthcare startup do in a place like Southeast Asia where the population is so young? What's the opportunity there exactly? Is it like super long-term, or is there a short-term play that could lead into a long-term play?
Yes, I think it's a combination of both. So when we looked at this, we thought if we were to start with this kind of notion that we believe that potentially 80% of healthcare will be digitalized and brought online over the next 10 years. And then so we start with that endpoint in mind, and then we work backwards, saying if that's the end case, we need to optimize towards the largest body of payer in that new system. And the reality is that largest body of payer in the future is not going to be our parents. It's going to be men and women in their 20s and 30s living in the capital cities today. And you're right in the fact that we believe that they don't have any healthcare problems, but the statistical need for a lot of the simple to treat conditions, lifestyle conditions, and diseases that are out there is very, very significant. So we set out on a vision to kind of starting to build that relationship at a younger age, being preventive with it, and earning trust through simple to treat conditions to start with. And as Pauline said, as they age, the statistical need for all other conditions that will be presentable in life, hopefully we have earned the right to exist in their lives by then and present them with solutions and offerings that come later on. So a lot of things that we say internally, kind of, we have this kind of quote that we follow a lot, which is ideally the guy that buys hair loss treatments from us today becomes eventually the guy that buys cholesterol drugs from us when he's 60 years old. So the opportunity to be along that customer for that long period of time is really, really presentable in this format.
So I'm going to ask the same question, modified a little bit for Pauline, and I'll modify the question for Kashish because you obviously run a B2B startup here. So Pauline, Singapore. It's very similar to the dynamics of, let's say, a Korea or Japan. And just before this, I was watching a documentary saying the births per family, I think it was, in Korea is like below 1, below replacement now. So the population's plummeting. Singapore, I'm not quite sure, but it's probably the same. Okay, so Southeast Asia is the opposite. You're coming from Singapore, you run a government center, you guys are deploying funds throughout Southeast Asia. Maybe you can talk about the rationale for seeing that opportunity to invest in that young population around the region, and what does Singapore have to benefit from that from your point of view?
Okay, maybe just to clarify, so for us, we can't invest in countries outside of Singapore, but we work with them. And why do we want to grow innovations within Singapore? Because it's kind of like what you try to do in Singapore, you can then populate it elsewhere so that others can access good healthcare standards, hopefully at an affordable price, right? And we're never going to be able to scale because the population, as you said, is really small. So even if we don't have a good birth replacement rate, we're just about 3.5 million people. So can you imagine if now, I think on average it's just one kid replacing two parents. So we're gonna probably be like 2 million in some days to come. Yeah. So it doesn't make sense if we're developing technologies or innovations just for ourselves, right? We want to be able to help others benefit from it. So say for example, some of the things that we're looking at is say genomic sequencing, to be able to sequence people's, have the full data sequence so that perhaps we can tell whether or not some of these people are predisposed to diseases. And using strong digital power, you might be able to predict. And why do you want to predict? Because A, either you can help to prevent or delay it, or B, if you had a therapeutic for it, you can then make it precise, like precision medicine, right? So many people, nowadays, for example, if you get cancer, touch wood, hope you don't get cancer, but when you do get cancer, the current therapeutic is very generic. So like for people lose their hair because the therapy also hits good cells, like regular cells, so you lose your hair. If you only knew like which part, which gene or which whatever to target, you will then treat that specific problem and not hit the rest of your cells. So we're trying to do that. And this sort of technology, if we're able to percolate it, it will definitely benefit the rest of the world. And of course, Southeast Asia being our neighboring nations would be the best place to start with a new technology like this, right? Because we want to be able to make it affordable and accessible. Yeah,
accessible is important. Technology adoption. We were talking about that offline, where doctors are so busy, they have too many patients. How can you even have 2 minutes of their time to introduce a new program, let alone technology? So best wishes on that effort.
Thank you.
Kashish, over to you as well. I was doing a bit of research about your company. It sounds very sophisticated, very expensive, maybe. Okay. But I'll let you answer that, because today's panel is about affordability as well. So I want to hear about how, from a hardware B2B perspective, your startup potentially is helping to solve that problem of affordability. And I just want to add to that before you answer too. Coming from Vietnam, where the hospitals are primarily public hospitals and they're overburdened already, technology can help help with processes, efficiency, but where's the money going to come from? How are they going to afford these new equipments? So maybe you can add to that, share about how your startup and the industry is helping to solve that.
Sure. So we've been doing this for the past 6 years, right? We've been honing our expertise in micro and nanofabrication. And the whole time, we've always had a very keen interest in value-added precision components. And of course, we haven't been doing this in a vacuum. We've been partnered with private entities, research entities to help accelerate their technology and really bring it to fruition. So the kind of things that we do, to give you a bit of an example, let's say there was a device that we worked on a while ago, which is for blood diagnostics, for red blood cell diagnostics, right? So we assisted in fabricating this device. We replaced conventional methods. This is really critical because, to put it in a nutshell, the device is populated with very unique, very specific micro features that achieve the same function as conventional processes, but in a footprint that's about 3 times lesser. So, conventional methods that you were mentioning, right, they're expensive. There's too much chemical use, there's too much reagent use, the fabrication of the chip itself is really expensive. If you go to some of the conventional chips can range between 150 to all the way to 800 USD, depending on complexity and what kind of diagnostics you're applying it for. So, our company really focuses on enhancing utility of these kinds of chips, condensing it into one platform, and you shave the price down to the order of about tens of dollars, So that's one way in which we put in the best effort we can to make sure that healthcare is affordable and a lot more accessible to people within the region by really, deploying this critical technology in a meaningful way.
Very good. Thank you for sharing that. One of my follow-up questions, the three of you are from Singapore, but I imagine there's some at least regional.
I live in KL, just to clarify.
Oh, KL, sorry.
The company is Singapore-based,
Gotcha.
but I'm based out of KL.
Gotcha. Regardless, the three of you have a very Singapore/KL kind of centric perspective on things. And today's panel, I think the audience too is probably half from around China, Macau, Hong Kong, the other half are from Southeast Asia. And to kick off today's, we talked about the Temasek Google report about how the economy of Southeast Asia will be $4.7 billion by 2030. Someone else also mentioned earlier today that there should be like an ASEAN council of sorts to represent the region. I would love to get your guys' opinions on that from a healthcare perspective. For instance, from my point of view in Vietnam, everything from the government regulations, getting a license is totally different from, let's say, a Singapore. How could you approach that from a regional perspective? I want to hear your pros and cons and how your businesses or organizations have adapted to that. So I'm going to start with Pauline and then go down the panel.
Okay, well, the truth is ASEAN is made of all different countries, right? We've been trying to harmonize things, but it's just difficult. It's less like Europe, for example, like when the EMA, which is the FDA equivalent that approves the drugs and everything, it's harmonized across the countries in Europe, right? We can't get that to work yet in Southeast Asia. And honestly, if we could, it would be very, very beneficial. So say, for example, if something were to be approved in one of the countries, then it should automatically be available, to countries in Southeast Asia. Maybe even the rest of Asia, like China, Macau, and Hong Kong, right? Like, why are we so concerned about having all these different standards, right? Because healthcare, I mean, we saw during COVID, right? In the end, we were all using pretty much the same vaccines, in a way, right? If we could just accelerate that process to enable quick use, approval and use of drugs, it would definitely benefit. So it's not that these committees have not been formed. They have been, particularly for approval of drugs and everything. It's just that at some point we still have not gotten to a stage that there is real harmonization across the countries. Yeah.
Elias, I would love to hear from you. I know you worked across the region already, so you kind of have an answer from your past experiences.
Yeah, so for us, we have a fully vertical business. That means we own the pharmacies and we own the clinics that we operate. And I think what we have realized is, given that we are Singapore-based and follow the Singapore regulations and implementation and processes, a lot of the other countries are always looking up to Singapore for the regulations that are being implemented. So I think it was in 2018, Singapore started with the LEAP project, which was a telehealth kind of project that embarked on. A lot of that has been setting the precedent across the whole region. So as long as we follow those kind of, I know it's not harmonized yet, but a lot of them are looking to Singapore for regulations and kind of setting the scene for the region. And it's been fairly easy for us to then operate and implement those kind of licensing and working with the government and MOHs across the whole region. I'm a very big fan of complexity. And I think that is the defensibility and moat that you build in Southeast Asia for new entrants to come in globally. So when it's very complex, we need to set up a lot of physical infrastructure in around the region. That gives us the moat and defensibility for global competitors that are coming in that are really struggling to understand and operate in Southeast Asia. It was true for, the obvious cases of Uber and Grab. It was true for ASOS that competed with us when I was at Zalora. Amazon challenges in e-commerce. So getting into the region, understanding the complexity of the region, it needs to be reflected in your cap table. You want to have a lot of different shareholders that have vested interest in your business, and making sure that you build that complexity and you really, and just take that complexity and make it your best friend, because it becomes a real big defensibility within your business. And so I think being Singapore-based again has harmonized, not directly, but indirectly. A lot of them are looking up to Singapore. We have a very broad medical advisory board that are primarily Singapore-based, and it helped us a ton getting into MOHs and sandbox projects in the whole region. So although it's not officially there, I think indirectly it's already happening to some extent, which is good. And Singapore has really strong kind of authority and authenticity within their healthcare programs that a lot of their regional countries are looking at too as well. So that's good.
Very good. Kashish, over to you for that question as well.
I think I'd have to concur with what Elias said. We're quite fortunate in that the kind of diagnostic devices that we work with are they're non-invasive. So our route to approval is fairly straightforward, and like Elias was saying, a lot of countries look up the Singapore standard. So it's quite synergistic for us so far. There's minimal tweaks we have to make to the viability or the standards that we're applying to our devices, because getting approval for them is quite similar across the regions, at least the regions that we are currently targeting. So that roadmap actually is quite safe, although I can't speak to drugs. So yeah, I can't comment on that.
Oh, I need to share a really interesting
please.
case study with you guys, right? So one of our startups that we funded got approval from the Thai Medical Device Authority before it was approved in Singapore. So it's the reverse. Yeah. So maybe maybe at some point we will eventually harmonize.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of these kind of complexity within the market. So Singapore requires registration for certain things where other markets don't require it, and it's the vice versa as well. So I think at-home test kits, for example, is a special area of kind of what needs to be registered and what not. But overall, broadly, when you think about clinics, pharmacies, licenses are very similar. And when you start touching on the technology layer, you have the global benchmark. You need to be HIPAA compliant, GDPR compliant, and all that comes in as well.
So the two investors who mentioned healthcare as one of their more interesting outlooks for investing in Southeast Asia, they invested in Holodoc, which I understand to be Indonesia only, and they're a far number one in their category. In Vietnam, for that particular category as well, I can also think of a far number one. So my question for you guys is, if I'm an investor or a company from, let's say, a China or Hong Kong coming in, should I focus on a regional approach or double down on one country? So that's my first question. My second question would be, which country to choose? That's not a Singapore, because I'm sure you're gonna say Singapore. Which one, from your opinions and experience, would you choose outside of Singapore? So I'll start with Pauline.
Okay. I think it depends on what the technology is, right? Because I think previously as well, when the panel before this, they were talking about they will still continue investing in SaaS. So it's likely that a healthcare company that integrates like telehealth and all that, you will still be targeting countries with large volumes of people. So still your Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, where numbers matter, right?
Very diplomatic answer.
But it's true. But if you're talking about like say hardcore medical devices or drugs, then you might want to choose a country that it's really strong in that kind of expertise. So maybe
Manufacturing, you mean?
even just maybe R&D, right? The development stage, getting regulatory approval because you have to make sure that QC is done properly. So it would be like Singapore, Korea, these kind of countries that have that kind of infrastructure. Yeah.
Okay. Well, she's taking a more, I guess, diplomatic approach. I want to hear from a consumer perspective and then a B2B perspective. So, Elias.
Okay. I wouldn't be able to just say one country, honestly. I think the opportunity in Southeast Asia is the regional Southeast Asia, and you need to go after the regional opportunity for it to be big enough. And so typically what you have is it's going to be the Singapore-based or Indonesian-based to start with. That's where the capital goes into. And really, that's the only region, or the real markets where true competition will come from right now. So if there's a competitor being either entering or emerging in Singapore, Indonesia, they are going to be probably very, they have access to talent, they have access to capital. It's very unlikely still at this stage that a regional company becomes really forceful coming out of Philippines, coming out of Vietnam, coming out of Thailand. It will come, but I think historically and probably for the next couple of years, it's still these two dominant countries. And you can see that historically as well. It's always the Indo players versus Singapore players, and they struggle to do Southeast Asia. Indonesian companies can't get out, Singapore ones can't get into Indo, and it becomes this war all the time. So I think I can't just say one additional market. I think for us it's Singapore headquartered. We launched Singapore, Malaysia at the same time. We saw a really big opportunity in Philippines, the demographic that we after, the pre-existing demand that exists in Manila as a city. I mean, we talk a lot about countries. Our focus is really capital cities, because people talk a lot about the complexity of the different Southeast Asian countries. And yes, the countries are very, very different culturally, ethnicity, etc. But the reality is Bangkok, KL, Jakarta, Manila, Singapore, they are very, very similar capital cities. And people that are living and working in those capital cities are experiencing very similar challenges. So it's much easier to do Southeast Asia if you just focus on the capital cities. And then once you've nailed that, you go into the regions. Trying to do countries is extremely complex. You have a lot of challenges with delivery, logistics. You need to really start localizing beyond English as a primary language, et cetera, et cetera. But if you just focus on the capital cities, there's enough depth there, if you do enough of the cities, for you to build a very meaningful business. So for us, we don't have a real priority. We focus on English speaking and where the opportunities are, and then expand into. We are staying away from Indonesia. We are not seeing that's not on our immediate roadmap, so we focus on other markets.
Very good. And last question, Kashish, same to you.
So, if I can't say Singapore, speaking from a deep tech perspective, I'd say the other two regions that are really interesting to us from a technical side is Korea and Japan. There's a lot of excellent companies over there that are actually pivoting now to also climb onto the booming healthcare trend. Companies like even really established companies like Sony DADC are now pivoting to provide manufacturing of diagnostic chips for the consumer and for clinical settings and for point of care sites, because they definitely realize how big that market is and how much of a space there is and all of that. So I would probably point my finger at these two regions if I can't say Singapore.
If I can't say Singapore, I would say Vietnam. So, although I'm not a healthcare expert. Well, very much big thanks to the three of you here today. We're wrapping up our panel, so we'll call it the end of the panel here. Thank you so much to Pauline, Elias, and Kashish for joining today from Singapore, all three of you, and sharing about insights about healthcare to our audience today. Round of applause, please, for our panelists.
Thanks, Hal.
Thank you.
Thanks.